Well, now let's get into the comparison of different schools. How do they communicate the MSHSAA standards or compliance, and how do they compare? There's always going to be some overlap, just to make sure people are informed instead of saying just go to the MSHSAA standards. LSR 7 school district, class 5 public school, they have a dedicated 35-page athletics and activities handbook. That was overwhelming. Blue Springs High School, our rival, class 5 public school, has 1.5 pages dedicated, right, within the parent-student handbook. Now, the parent-student handbook, of course, is probably itself about 20 pages, but interesting how they could put in the information necessary in 1.5 pages versus 35. And then Mountain City has a dedicated, that's a class 1 public school, has a dedicated 11-page athletics and activities handbook. Also, so interesting, they do have, I felt like it was the most concise and added a lot to scholarship, sportsmanship, which I liked. This is just an overview of the sections of the MSHSAA handbook and whether it was explicitly referenced or expounded upon within their handbooks. So all the yellow ones basically are represented in all 3 sections, the dashes not represented. And the green, to me, were the differences. Lee's Summit School District didn't indicate any academic requirements specifically, but clearly still accountable to MSHSAA, but didn't feel like it needed to be put in the handbook. And then second, we go down to residency and transfer requirements. They do have a section. Now, I believe it is because we've got 3 high schools within this school district, and the boundary lines change. And people within the district move from one side of a line to another side of a line to attend different schools. Maybe because one school is more modern and beautiful, and not saying I'm jealous or anything, but daylight is nice during the day. So I think they've put that in specifically because transfer requirements are pretty common, basically in maintaining eligibility. For citizenship, I've gone in and tried to summarize items, because really that's where they've taken the MSHSAA and taken it to their own or interpreted on their own as far as consequences. My first look is at illegal drugs, alcohol use, and tobacco use. On Mountain City, they have no reference to alcohol use or tobacco use. They have a statement on the side about vaping and tobacco use, and basically said it's the discretion of the administrator. But they do talk about violations first, second, third, fourth, and fifth. Thought that was interesting. But wow, ineligible for 2 weeks of competition, 5 weeks, 9 weeks, the whole year, right? The remainder of high school career. And then they're just done, right? So that is convicted for felonies, basically, that last column. So 5th violation is huge. I thought the weeks thing was interesting because it would go from one sport to the next as far as restrictions. As far as Blue Springs and Lee Summit, they have a percentage-based system. Blue Springs has drugs, alcohol, and tobacco all in the same, and they've got a 20% on first violation. Lee Summit separates illegal drugs and alcohol use, has an initial 40%, so that's big. I mean, let's be honest. I never drank in high school because I did not want to be suspended. I wanted to play sports. But the prevalence of drinking in our culture and controlled substances is ridiculous, and I wish it were different, but it's not. Lee Summit has a much steeper penalty versus Blue Springs. So that's tough, right? Then, as far as required 10 hours of drug, alcohol, counseling, right? Basically in their first violation for anything related to illegal drugs and alcohol use. As far as tobacco use, that's where Lee Summit and Blue Springs line up, and that includes e-cigarettes and vaping. And then you can see 40% violation, or 40% of the contest for second, and then suspension for a year. Second violation, right away ineligible for 365. So not even a chance for third violation. It's just done. So I thought that was interesting. If I were a parent, I'd be glad that my student was held to a high account, but I'd be a little frustrated if my friend's child, let's just say that my friend's child, and another student from Blue Springs, an athlete in Blue Springs, competing against each other, show up at the same party because Facebook has unified, or Twitter, or Snapchat has unified across boundary lines. They show up to the same party, and one gets 20%, the other gets 40%. Interesting. All of them have a clause that if they self-report, it implies that these strict or designated consequences become more of a negotiation. But if they're found out, then it's right to the books. As far as other citizenship items, unexcused absences, in-school suspension, out-of-school suspension, hazing, bullying, felonies, Mound City ineligible for excused absences, Blue Springs no mention, and eligible until criteria of administration. So LSR 7 looks like determined by administration is quite common. Out of school punishment, or OSS, out of school suspension, that's pretty big. Like Lee Summit North, if you get in a fight, you're suspended immediately, 5 days. So for that, you are ineligible for the duration of the punishment. Same with Mound City. Blue Springs, harsh, right? And maybe that's something they can negotiate. But I thought that was a harsh consequence. Hazing, mentioned in Mound City, mentioned in Blue Springs, LSR 7. In 35 pages, you'd think you'd be clear. It was defined, but no specific consequences were detailed. Bullying, no mention for Mound City. Blue Springs, same punishment for illegal substances, and not mentioned in LSR 7. And then for felonies, this is that democratic system. In Mound City, permanently ineligible. But in Blue Springs and Lee Summit, until all time is served, so probation periods, etc. And that might be the democratic. It's once you've served your punishment that you can be restored to society. And I think that's probably the take for Blue Springs and Lee Summit. In conclusion, because there are so many different consequences for behaviors at similar schools, even with smaller schools, I think ineligibility will also always be a source of frustration between competitors and their parents. Could conferences make efforts to have similar consequences? Could Blue Springs and Lee Summit talk to each other? Could class designation statewide make efforts to be similar? Not sure. It's hard when demographics are different. It's hard when culture is different, say rural, Mound City, versus suburban versus inner city. So yeah, it was an interesting research project. Challenging because there was a lot of information and hard to boil down, but I hope that works.